general population knows and don't know they are used as an experiment continuously. You are awake, and you know who the enemy is, the enemy of humanity, the elite of our world.
You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future.
We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.
Greetings, citizens. Palantir also regularly wipes info on the web, but it's a dangerous force that needs awareness. Peter Thiel's CIA-backed data mining firm Palantir honed its crime predicting techniques against insurgents in Iraq.
In November, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point received the Sinjar records. They have since released 2 in-depth analytical reports, employing the Palantir platform to extract a broad range of novel insights from.
The same methods are now being sold to police departments.
But by inputting that information into Palantir, she was able to work up a suspect that became a really viable piece of information for the detectives. That's the kind of thing that these information systems bring. They can take the smallest clue and turn it into something big.
But what's most concerning is that pre-crime is now through the use of quantum computing Saturn Cube D-Wave for the elite, which is then tied through the National Geo-spatial Agency. Using this nexus of powers was the main subject of the 2018 Bilderberg Meeting. Palantir is blatantly a tool for ill, as the term references Sauron's evil eye in the sky in Lord of the Rings.
Sauron, Lord of the Earth.
The evil eye is blatantly in the hands of world controllers. Palantir does not have an office, it has a SIF on a back street in Palo Alto, California. SIF stands for Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility. These networks are air-gapped or separated from the collective internet. The National Geo-spatial Intelligence Agency via Palantir and D-Wave watches everything you do and predicts what you will do next, with the overarching idea of controlling the masses.
However, it's important to make the distinction between imagery intelligence and geospatial intelligence. Even though geospatial information can receive its source materials from satellites and remote piloted vehicles, just like imagery intelligence, GeoInt also receives its materials from other sources, such as elevation data and infrared and vector maps. All the data GeoInt incorporates allows analysts to understand the environment without actually having to set foot there.
Ground corrective telemetry software looks right everyone at eye level through any barrier given wavelength variety. It's like these super forces are standing right in front of you. And the NGA has all data from all other intelligent agencies. These guys are following your data and literal using footprint Palantir augmented by D-Wave quantum computing. And again, the intention is dark, as the CIA and QTEL D-Wave takes Saturn Cube cult form. NGA with D-Wave and Palantir siphons all independent intelligence agency, while each surfaces with their own pre-crime predictions based on their dataset. By 2013, its client list included the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Center for Disease Control, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, Special Operations Command, West Point and the IRS. In 2019 it's fucking ubiquitous among ruling powers. Peter Thiel secretly built Palantir via venture fund Mithril Capital Management. Another Lord of the Rings reference is telling us it's Sauron's evil eyes idolizes, to launder the $444 million setting up the Minority Report juggernaut. Mithril also funds Oris surgical robots, which Thiel worked at the last 2018 Bilderberg meeting to make quick work of body sympathico-subdermal technology.
These look like little organic robots, like nanomachines.
Thiel also moves anonymous money through the Founders Fund. When you realize that this high tracking capability is literally outthinking and outwatching human capacity, the second red pill hits. Sauron is not here to watch you, that's a side effect. What they have been working towards with key members in Tavistock like John Rawlings Rees since before even the OSS is mind control.
Headed by John Rawlings Rees, creator of the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Tavistock, and the British Army's chief psych warfare expert during World War II. Mental hygiene went global, and a massive conference was convened in London in 1948.
Can serve as a springboard for more meaningful discussion and think about the nature of the problem.
To mold the post-war New World man, starting inside his own head.
Because it enables the individual to fit into an orderly system. Being a member of an organized group offers a basis for emotional stability to every man.
Heavily funded by the British and American governments, the private philanthropic foundation. It almost seemed like a global Manhattan project for the mind was kicking off.
Although the human intelligence agencies all would certainly become involved with mind control.
Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Can you tell me if there's any change at all?
Truth Media illustrates a good backdrop of where we actually are. Alan Dulles, who with brother John Foster Dulles laundered Nazi elites into 750 leading companies in America before the war was over, even via law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, then went to take over the CIA and his brother the State Department as they turned their beady eyes towards the mind control. Using Nazi and Wallenberg experiments, they moved all the necessary Nazi scientists to the US through Operation Paperclip. Stalin was killed so US and Soviet brainwashing procedure could advance unhindered.
Convene with the ideological successors of Pavlov, who were working on the, quote, mechanization of the central nervous system. For years, Stalin had forbid cybernetics in the Soviet sphere, despite its origins in the physiological labs where Pavlov studied dogs. However, Stalin's conspicuous death in March of 1953, just 1 month before the official start of MKUltra, had opened the door to both Soviet and world cybernetics. The speech effectively launched MKUltra, gave a plausible reason for the dark, disturbing research. Dulles would sign the memo, creating the CIA's most notorious secret research project just 3 days later, and ironically only a few weeks after the death of Stalin, who had ruled Soviet Russia for 25 years with an iron fist.
Mind control. Dr. Wilder Graves Penfield was put into all the privatized policy-making circles by Rockefellers who like to have their fingers in every evil pie.
The Rockefeller Foundation spent more than $1.25 million to create McGill's Montreal Neurological Institute, and recruited Penfield to head it, after ruling out basing his controversial research in New York. The medical ethics differed slightly in Canada, and
thus began the work of human intelligence.
the two would move forward, but in the quiet conspiracy of brain doctors and their patrons, who would become determined to identify the buttons of the brain and push them for shadowy agents.
A homunculus, which Penfield called his work with a growing mind control team like the golem of Jewish folklore, is a mental realm spirit who, having disproven the soul, unmakes itself and awaits in a soulless dimension until summoned by alchemy to create soulless automatons. This mind control was then honed through experimentation with mental patients initiated by Harold Abramson, known as MKUltra.
OSS and CIA asset psychiatrist Harold Abramson, who worked on top-secret chemical warfare projects at Fort Detrick, some of which were co-sponsored by the Macy's Foundation itself, and who would run multiple MKUltra projects involving LSD experimentation.
The Fort Detrick site, after being the MKUltra base, was used by Rockefeller's Club of Rome ties in the creation of AIDS, which we covered in another video. The field of psychology came into fruition beyond its foundation with computer theory reducing humanity into choice and impulse which could be manipulated and gamed. The statistically aberrant minds became a double target, isolating increased pathos for manipulation while also eliminating the very ones who would not respond to common manipulation.
The common code between the communication of the nervous system and the computer's binary processing language. They wanted to show the effect of the physical world on the mind in statistical terms, data, input, output. Eventually, all the entities will sync to the dominant, whichever is making the most accurate and reliable long-term decisions, whoever is setting the pace and the trends, which could carry out any number of simultaneous calculations and feed back into the mental loop.
Von Neumann creating the initial computer architecture after its World War II invention by Alan Turing. Penfield, summoner of homunculus, worked with von Neumann. They together lay the grid of programming humanity.
Von Neumann held that it was probably not cerebral cortex that determined awareness, but more likely something in the midbrain. And I suggested the importance of the thalamus. Fremont Smith went into different degrees of consciousness, from full attention through twilight states to sleep and hysterical amnesia. Molly Howard described the stimulation of the cortex she witnessed under Dr. Penfield, which did not disturb the patients, yet threw them into a panic when stimulation caused vocalization resembling speech. The distinction between conscious and aware.
Members of the Macy's conferences, including Frank Fremont Smith, Margaret Mead, Clyde Kluckholm, Henry W. Brosen, and Molly Harwood, also sat on the governing board of the International Committee on Mental Hygiene.
Oh my God. Oh no, don't let them take me in there.
Headed by John Rawlings Rees, creator of the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Tavistock Institute, and the British Army's chief psych warfare expert during World War.
From MKUltra, the binary non-problem solving taught in public schools for making automatons was pumped internationally via UNESCO.
Conference, a supposedly scientific World Federation of Mental Health, was established. John Rawlings Rees left the Tavistock Institute to become its first president, a seat that both Fremont Smith and Mead would later fill as well. The group's motto, borrowed from the UNESCO Constitution, was, quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed."
In terms, as a sort of national 2019 New Year's resolution.
President Trump removed the U.S. as a member of the body, which was then followed by...
Nonetheless, through this Prussian-born UNESCO indoctrination, the binary NPC was created at large.
I would like to follow that remark. When we were talking this morning, von Neumann was saying that the brain could not be an analog calculating machine, but must be a digital one.
A machine with an analogic part
and a digital part. So the analog part is able to create analogies that mirror observed actions in human beings with whom we communicate.
Such a device may also use data from previous experience to predict the future.
Tapestry woven from the memories of past sensations.
What are you? Oh, I can't tell where this is going.
Curiouser. What kind of place is this?
This Pavlovian man was made for an think tank game theory control.
The behavior, the responses of Pavlovian conditioning, perception, and reality. In the end, the whole of man can be controlled through his dependence on his environment.
It wasn't long before environmental controls were traded for direct internal control.
Delgado had implanted a series of electrodes into the aggression center of a bull's brain. And then he invited the press.
The electrodes are attached to a small transistorized electrical stimulator, which is cemented to the bull's skull. The electrical stimulator in the skull responds to radio stimulation, so the bull is literally subject to remote control.
Delgado has remote control of the animal.
When the remote control apparatus is operated and the bull's caudate nucleus is stimulated, the bull becomes non-aggressive.
They made animals stepping stones like mice.
A new window on the brain was opened in 1953, when a rat fortuitously evidenced a neuro-rewarding effect. By returning to the place where he had been when an electrical stimulus was applied to the brain via chronically implanted electrodes.
In terms of conditioned behavior, this electrically induced reward became an end unto itself. In 1954, Olds created a reward map of the brain featuring locations where electrical stimulation caused mammals to come back for more.
Human and animal experimentation continued with ever-increasing money and resources.
Reportedly offended at the abhorrent suggestion, he was quoted in dozens of papers as saying,
"I took the stand that if I wanted to be a spy, I'd be a spy. I wanted to be a doctor and practice medicine."
But in reality, Dr. Robert G. Heath had been investigating the effects of mind-altering surgeries and substances for the government since at least 1943, when as a military psychiatrist and chief resident at the Neurological Institute in New York tied to Columbia University, he performed experimental leucotomies and tested ergotamine tartrate, a precursor to LSD derived from ergot, on war-weary, psychologically stressed merchant marines.
Dr. Robert G. Heath, who joined the MKUltra team, quickly graduated from induced suggestions to hardware implants.
Although there is little evidence that Heath's experiments were actually therapeutic. By 1952, Dr. Heath had already outfitted nearly 24 mental patients with semi-permanent electrodes in their brains.
Teamed with CIA secrecy, Dr. Heath added drugged stupors to implanted electrodes.
Perhaps not so coincidentally, Tulane University reportedly signed off on a facility security clearance for Heath's entire department afterwards.
Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain.
FOIA documents would later reveal that Heath also took a CIA contract in 1955 to study the effects of the drug bulbocapnine, allegedly being tested by the Soviets to induce stupor and break willpower.
Freud's whole shtick was based on pleasure and pain, and as psychology grew, the government's secret school of psychology completely controlled these drives.
We quickly learned that they could mitigate pain or induce a deep-seated pleasure or even sexual arousal with the push of a button.
How do you feel? You're trying to tell me how it excites you, right?
Oh, I think it's someone with a sexy button.
They controlled fear and rage.
By placing electrodes deep within the brain, investigators, including Dr. Jose Delgado of Yale University, have located precise regions that activate emotions such as fear and rage, and basic drive such as hunger and sex.
And from their full social control on largely negative pressure points.
And Delgado had virtually mastered an elaborate program of behavior modifications which he demonstrated in his monkeys.
The motor cortex is probably like a large keyboard, able to play the strings of muscular contraction and to produce movements.
In his Thiel laboratory, Dr. Delgado has gone even further. By pushing a button, he controls life in a colony of monkeys. He can direct their behavior and change the neatly ordered structure of their society.
All these controls have been accessible from remote distance since near the beginning.
That Delgado was able to reliably provoke a single monkey into carrying out a complex series of 12 actions that led to attacking a rival monkey. When a computer-programmed signal was sent to the monkey's stimoceiver, the monkey predictably carried out the same sequence of actions in the exact same order every single time, 20,000 times in a row.
And from a remote location, human could be reduced to emotional rubble in mere moments.
From about 200 other points, ESB produced unpleasant reactions including anxiety, sadness, depression, fear, and emotional outbursts. A female patient reported feeling threatened, that she thought something horrible was going to happen, a premonition of imminent disaster of unknown cause.
With total government funding, an excuse had to be made to do experiments on massive amounts of people, so the largely mythological concept of mental illness was born.
To the blatant lack of scientific, political, or ethical critique of the disturbing trend of psychosurgery and electrical brain stimulation.
Mental illness is a myth, a fraud, a bad metaphor, an excuse, a rationalization. It's a religious viewpoint held by psychiatrists which says that human troubles are somehow medical in origin and medical in their solution. Now, just how poverty, unemployment, unhappiness, fights between husbands and wives, beatings of children, anxiety, alienation, just how all these problems relate to medicine and relate to illness is never stated.
Aside from creating a catch for any and all aberrant behavior, government began experimenting on the poor and disenfranchised at large.
Has created this new, in quote, technology. There is the desire to use it, you see, and the most logical population to use it against are poor people, black people, and people who are incarcerated.
The Boston doctors called for an extensive research project to identify the early warning signs of violent behavior and pinpoint, diagnose, and treat people in inner cities with what they termed low violence thresholds before they had actually committed any violent acts.
President Johnson created a task force of mind control doctors who would then produce reports on demand to fill up jails with prisoners who they then subjected to more experimentation.
President Johnson created the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Today, a task force of that commission released its first findings, concluding that Americans have become a rather bloody-minded people.
Still, mental patients became the most essential and unquestioned base for study, and they became the spear tip for guiding innocents into violent acts.
And I got a letter from Leonard's mother, and it said, "Now I understand. I knew they turned my son into a vegetable," she used that word, "but now I see what it was, what they were doing to him. He's been horribly destroyed since he came back from Boston. He's had multiple hospitalizations, chronic patient at the VA."
It wasn't until after his treatment in Boston that Leonard committed his first official act of public violence.
Who cared what the mental patients would say about treatment? They dismissed with programmed nonchalance, like the term conspiracy theorist created in the 1967 Warren Report carries still today.
When he was finally discharged in May 1968, Leonard's records read, "Patients stated that Massachusetts General Hospital were controlling him by creating lesions in his brain tissue by microwave, and that they had placed electrodes in his brain tissue. Stated that they can control him, control his moods, and control his action. They can turn him up or turn him down, just like a mechanical toy."
Just like anyone talking about mind control even after a near century of traceable research sounds nuts.
About consciousness transfer, and it started with MKUltra. And the reason why this is important is because there's a lot of people that are unwillingly participating in this shit. They don't even fucking know it. Mind control. And it started with Germany. Started after World War II. All the Nazis were, escorted, VIP'd in. All the top scientists and military personnel were harbored in the United States, South America.
Feedback control loops were created to move larger groups.
If one could modify the way the brain processes signals, one could program the brain, the behaving entity, just like the equipment in missile control rooms, and just like the experimental animals who'd been conditioned to perform predictable behaviors in the lab.
Mind control from these programs aficionados like Dr. Louis Jolyon West would go on to program all the greats of the last millennia.
Under the medical direction of Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Dr. West spent his entire career first in the military and later in academia, researching all manner of behavior modification, everything from cults to communist mind control techniques, dissociation, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, hallucinogens, for which he attended cybernetician Frank Fremont Smith's Macy's conference on LSD, social engineering, and more.
Jared Kushner is now in bed financially with Peter Thiel and Peter's Palantir hooked up to D-Wave, and the NGA bouncing off 5G towers is a new level of remodification so elegant, so wickedly great, the NPC memes can't do the mind control justice. CIA mind control experimentation continues today despite the plethora of information worked for the last century.
Reveal that mind control techniques using drugs were also used on prison inmates at the time, with agents using experimental drugs on prisoners who had been hospitalized. The drugs were administered forcefully and without consent from the subjects, with the goal to reduce inhibition to revealing self-incriminating information during interrogations while the inmates were awaiting trial. The documents also detailed the CIA's interrogation practices. Forms of physical, psychological, and mechanical torture included everything from threats to drugs that cause pain to truth serums that were forcibly used on subjects.
And this information is now being worked to program from the womb.
Dr. Cameron wanted to erase, rewrite, and program the mind and the person with all new thoughts and behaviors. And he used CIA and Rockefeller Foundation funding to do it.
Cameron wrote, this was the way to make direct, controlled changes in personality. Is that what you were in?
All this tech makes more sense when understanding the wealth of mind control data that so-called pre-crime is actually used as behavioral controls that already operate with a social credit system not unlike China. And a control on a neural level beyond the public's capacity to understand. We are not Jesus. Nor do we have Alzheimer's. Expect us.